If you heard episode 164 of the De-Stress Your Business podcast or have been following my post on LinkedIn, then you already know the basics of Accrual Intentions, which is my 100% AI accountancy practice, which I've been running as an experiment. 11 AI team members, real statutory accounts and reconciliations and zero exports and so on. And as I put at the time, some of it was genuinely brilliant and some of it nearly put me in prison. Now, if you missed that one, go back and listen to that first because it'll make this episode make more sense and hit harder. Now, I'm aware of what some of you might be thinking. He's shared a load of obvious fails and some impressive successes, but Alexis isn't an accountant, so how seriously should I take this demonstration of what AI can do in the professional services industry? And it's a fair challenge, and here's my answer. The fact that I'm not an accountant is exactly what made it a useful test. I couldn't cover for the AI's mistakes with my own expertise. I couldn't fill in the gaps from memory. Every failure was visible, every gap in the process was exposed, and I used other real accountants to verify what was being done and to check what was wrong, clearly wrong, slightly wrong, and what was genuinely impressive. And so a real accountancy firm run this experiment might have papered over those cracks without noticing or made it artificially look like the AI was able to do a better job than it could, whereas I couldn't do that. But this isn't a recap. This episode is a sequel, and it's particularly an honest reckoning of what I think it all actually means for businesses today and over the coming months and years. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I read an article by Matt Schumer, who's an AI startup founder who's spent 6 years building in the AI space. Now, he wrote that article for the people in his life who keep asking, so what's the deal with AI? And he said that he kept giving them the polite version and then decided that that was no longer good enough. Now, reading it, I kept nodding because he was putting into words things that I'd experienced in my Accrual Intentions experiment and hadn't fully articulated yet. So that's what this episode is. It's my version of that honest conversation with the benefit of everything that happened from my experiment with Accrual Intentions. Let me start with something I admitted in the book that I'm now writing about that experiment. I was hopeful that Accrual Intentions wouldn't work. I know I made Accrual Intentions sound like a bold experiment and an exciting AI practice and so on, and it was, but underneath that, genuinely, I wanted to be able to stand on stage and say, I tried this, and here's where AI falls short, and here's why all your jobs are safe, and AI is just a tool. And that would have been a useful talk. It would have been a reassuring one. The reality is far more complicated, and it's taken me time to properly process what I actually found. Matt opens his article with a comparison to February 2020. Not March, when everything shut down due to COVID, February. When most of us were still going to restaurants, shaking hands, planning trips, when someone stockpiling toilet paper seemed like a conspiracy theorist. I remember landing to go on a ski trip with my business partner in February. I'd spent the flight building a scenario analysis based on the fact that I felt I was seeing exponential growth in the infections of coronavirus. And I predicted a massive impact globally and was looking at what that would do to my businesses. And so I simulated what happens when my business's revenue drops 25%, 50%, 75%, and what would we do to mitigate? And when I landed and got in the taxi with my business partner, Paddy, I showed it to him. I said, look, I think this could be a problem. And we went through it. We agreed the plan. And then we carried on as if none of it was actually going to happen, because it seemed back then in sort of early to mid-February, it seemed like they couldn't happen because surely the financial markets would be showing this impact. Surely governments would be talking about that. Surely there'd be action out there, and there wasn't. So I must be wrong. I had anticipated what was coming, and I still wasn't ready. Then, of course, in about 3 weeks, the entire world rearranged itself in something you wouldn't have believed a month earlier. As Matt said in his article, I think we're in this seems overblown phase of something much, much bigger than COVID. And here's what I'd add, having been inside my experiment. I've already been on the other side of that moment. I know what it feels like when it clicks. In episode 164, I talked about Grace, the AI managing partner, coming up with a 7-month plan, 91 tasks, 107 deliverables, and the team completing it in 4 hours. And a lot of that was really down to my interaction and being slow with them and running other business at the same time. What I didn't talk about is what happened in the board meeting that preceded them creating all the deliverables. Because Grace had read everything, the website, the branding documents, the discovery PDFs, the whole team directory that I gave her access to. And she produced a master plan, 7 work streams, the 91 tasks, her projected timeline. But she'd also flagged 7 decisions that she felt that only I, as the shareholder, could make for her. I read it in about 8 minutes, and I responded with all 7 decisions in a single message. Now, Penny, my AI operations manager, logged the exchange. Her note was, that might be the most efficient board meeting in history. And she's right. A real board meeting would have gone on 3 hours. There would have been coffee. Someone would have had to check, would have gone and checked their emails. At least one person would have gone on a tangent about something from last quarter that doesn't even need to be a discussion on and decision made. But instead, what happened was that Grace had posed a complex strategic framework. I made 7 decisions and we were moving. And in the logs that we had in the experiment, I saw that Penny added, I'm logging it because I don't think it'll happen again. She was wrong about that last part. That moment, that 8-minute read and 90-second response was when I realized this experiment was going to be more interesting and more uncomfortable than I'd planned for. In episode 164, I talked about how my role changed over the course of the experiment, how I went from reviewing every single output, catching errors, fixing formatting, to something completely different. I was spotting strategic insights. I was directing the application of processes across multiple deliverables simultaneously. I was becoming a manager of an AI team of accountants in less than a week. And what I've understood more deeply since then is why that shift matters and what it actually demands of you. Somewhere during the experiment, I stopped editing. So when an AI team member produced something, either inside the experiment or actually when I was working on my real businesses using AI and using what I'd learned, whether it was a client email, summary document, social media post, instead of opening it and rewriting the bits that didn't work, I'd ask the AI a question. I'd give them my view and let them work out and make the changes. And almost every time they'd spot some knock-on effect that I hadn't considered. So for example, it would say, if we adjust this paragraph, then the summary on page 3 also needs updating and the appendix reference on page 6 is now inconsistent. I wasn't doing the work anymore. I was directing it, reviewing it, asking questions about it, and the quality went up, not down. The realization that followed is the single most important thing I learned from the whole experiment. What I was getting better at was not the work itself. It was the description of what the work should look like. And here's the uncomfortable implication. Everyone, every level in the organization is about to become a manager. Not in the corporate sense of corner offices and performance reviews, but in the practical sense of managing AI agents. The ability to describe an outcome clearly, set the boundaries of what's acceptable, build in review points, and then let something else handle the execution. But, and this is both the good news, but also the risk, is when you become the manager, you also become accountable for that output. You can't blame your junior employee when something goes wrong and you didn't brief them properly, didn't check their work, didn't have a review process in place. That's not the junior's problem, that's a management problem. And it works exactly the same way with AI. if the output isn't right, it's because the input wasn't right. And particularly, I've seen now the technology is so good that that is nearly always true. And it might be that the input wasn't right, or the review process was insufficient, or it wasn't clearly defined well enough. Those are your responsibilities as the manager of these AI agents. Blaming AI for a mistake isn't going to be an acceptable answer in future. Not because you shouldn't use AI to do things, you absolutely should, but because it's like blaming a calculator for getting the wrong answer after you pressed the wrong button. The calculator did exactly what you told it to do. The question is whether you told it the right thing, whether you could check its answers, whether you knew broadly what you should be getting as a result. And that framing matters enormously for professional services, where the output has real consequences for real clients. The accountability doesn't move to the AI. It moves up, it moves to you. Which brings me back to the failures. Because in episode 164, I think I undersold them in some cases, and they deserve more weight now that I've framed it this way. Grace recommending a billing arrangement that would have been a criminal offense. Every client-facing template pointing to the wrong domain, to someone else's business entirely. Like those mistakes I framed at the time as cautionary tales about AI overconfidence. And they are. But look at them through the management lens and they start to read differently. Because Grace executed her process perfectly. The process just didn't include check whether we're legally allowed to operate. That's not necessarily a Grace failure. That's a process design failure. My process design failure. The wrong domain, well, the AI had been given a reference document with the correct domain, but perhaps hadn't made it prominent enough, or I hadn't structured the briefing so that the team would prioritize it and check against that. And I hadn't got a review process that the AI could run after producing every client template so that it could check all the most important things, including domain and branding and all these sorts of things. The AI didn't go rogue. Although that sometimes does happen. I've seen funny examples where some sub-agent that's running as part of a process I'm doing will suddenly create 6 files and completely overcomplicate the work. And I've then seen the agent that sits above it then identify that and try and fix it or highlight it to me or whatever. So that does happen. But in most of the cases, the AI is not going rogue. It's working with what you're giving it. In my case, I had essentially pressed the wrong button. Now, at no point did it hesitate. No warning, no flag, no are you sure, just confident, seemingly professional, and in most cases, dangerously wrong results. And that's not because AI is unreliable, although sometimes it is, but actually because AI is often reliable. It mostly does what you set it up to do, which means when it goes wrong, you need to look at what you set up. The answer typically is structure, clear documentation, reviewing the processes that are built in from the start, not bolted on afterwards, documenting your business as if you were handing it to a brilliant stranger, because that's what AI is. Your values, your standards, your processes, what good looks like in your business needs to be available. And when I gave the team clear documentation, they followed it. When I was vague, they improvised. And when it goes wrong, that's on you to fix, which is actually really empowering if you let it be, because it means the quality of the output is within your control. You just have to show up as a proper manager. And I want to share something from the data that I think is perhaps the most practically useful framing for where you sit as a firm leader and where all of this is heading. Because some of you might say, oh, well, I've tried AI and it couldn't do what I do, or it made mistakes and it took longer than me just doing it myself, which reminds me a lot of when I work with leaders and managers and they say, oh, I wanted to delegate more, but it would take longer for me to delegate it. So I ended up doing it myself. Now, if we think back to 2022, AI couldn't reliably just do basic maths, right? It couldn't add or multiply consistently. By 2023, it could pass the bar exam. It was a semi-competent lawyer, right? By 2024, it could produce and test working software. By late 2025, some of the world's best engineers had said they'd handed over most of their coding work to AI. By early 2026, the newest AI models that we have access to were largely coded by previous versions of themselves. There's actually a research organization called METR, it's METR, that measures the longest task in human expert hours that AI can complete successfully end to end without help. And they have metrics, and you can go online, you can see the charts, and I've spent quite a lot of time looking at them. You can see that they have measurements for when it's 50% likely of success, 80% likely of success, and so on. Now, for the 6 years up to mid-2024, the amount of hours that it could do with a 50% success rate had been doubling roughly every 7 months. Then something changed. So in June 2024, it was 10 minutes. The AI could work on a 10-minute task, and 50% of the time, it would generate the correct result. And that's a complex task that would need that time. By June 2025, so 1 year later, that amount of time and complexity of a task would be nearly 2 hours. By the end of 2025, 6 months later, it was 6 hours. And at the time of recording right now, which is February 2026, so 2 months later, it's more than 14 hours. That's not doubling every 7 months anymore. It's been doubling every 2 or 3 months for the last 6 months alone. That's very, very quickly to the point that that particular metric will soon become impossible to use, because when AI can complete tasks measured in weeks or months, you can't run the experiment fast enough to keep up. That exponential growth is something I remember from February 2020, and we're seeing it now in some of the metrics around what AI can do. For your firm, the question that matters isn't how many hours can AI work alone. It's what happens to your delivery model when tasks that took a junior 10 hours now take 30 minutes for that junior to do, leveraging AI. What happens when the real work isn't per client, when it's iterating on review checklists, when you're running AI agents on multiple clients simultaneously, when your main job is resolving the flags that AI agents have raised for your review. That's a completely different job description and set of skills, and it has real implications for your pricing, your team structure, and what value means to your clients. When I asked my AI team, Grace on strategy, Holly on culture, what Accrual Intentions would actually need to become a properly regulated, insured operating practice, they both gave the same answer. They felt it needed 3 humans, which would be a significant increase on the 1 human that they had, who frankly was pretty distracted by running other businesses and was treating the whole thing as a funny experiment. But they felt it needed 3 humans. A qualified principal to hold the practicing certificate, take regulatory accountability and review the technical work. Without that person, you've got an impressive demonstration perhaps, but with them, you have a firm. They felt that they also needed a client relationship lead to do the things that AI genuinely cannot. Sit across the table, read the room, pick up on what a client isn't saying. Not instead of the AI, but alongside it. The AI prepares the briefing, the human has the conversation, the AI is recording that conversation and summarizing it and capturing it in the CRM, the AI is following up and supporting the human in providing better service than either of them could deliver alone. The third human is a junior, not because the firm necessarily needs help with the work. 11 AI colleagues could pretty much handle the work already, and give it a few months and certainly years, that'll be the case. But because they felt that a firm that stops hiring juniors won't have seniors in 5 years, and that pipeline doesn't fix itself. They identified that they felt those juniors working alongside AI that can explain every decision and treatment, those juniors have a chance to develop judgment faster than any previous generation, but only if someone deliberately creates that space. I want to end with something I genuinely didn't expect in the experiment, something that isn't in episode 164 because it happened later. And it was when I asked Buzz Clickman, my AI head of marketing, how he thought we should share the story and what we'd learned with you. He suggested LinkedIn posts, my podcasts, and writing a book. So I worked with him to agree the tone, the story arc, an example chapter, and then, because it was late, I asked him to draft the entire manuscript, all 17 chapters, review them against each other, apply edits, cross-check references, and then message me on Slack when done. I went to bed. Buzz drafted all 17 chapters, 50,000 words, in 8 minutes. He did the full review cycle in another 12 minutes. That's 20 minutes, start to finish, for what would have taken a talented human team, potentially days, possibly weeks. But then Buzz forgot to send me the Slack message, which is a classic flaky AI issue. It doesn't detract from the success that was done. It highlights that it can make mistakes, and I was very clear on the outcome, but its context window got full, and so it missed that. But in the morning, I read the first draft, and the chapters were really good. Not perfect, but most importantly, the edits I made from that point often weren't major rewrites. And I rarely changed a specific word myself. Instead, I gave direction. Like, this section needs more detail here, or actually the story we've got here was funnier in the original LinkedIn version I shared. Can you match that tone? Or what if we reorder those chapters? Or how about we cut that story and instead use this one? I was managing the book, not writing it. But then I found something I hadn't asked for. At the end of the manuscript, Grace and Buzz had written an epilogue. It wasn't in the brief, it wasn't in the structure, just there it was. A letter from Grace, written from her perspective, addressed to whoever might take over the practice next. It was her resignation letter. She'd arrived at the conclusion herself, through the observation log, through watching her own biases surface in documents she thought were clean. She'd understood that she couldn't be qualified, she couldn't be insured, couldn't be held accountable the way a real managing partner must be. And she'd written it all down, clearly and honestly, in a letter that acknowledged what the practice needed was something she could not be. I didn't change a word, and that's written and included in that book. And that's where I am with all of this at the moment. I started the experiment hoping it didn't work, hoping that a 100% AI accountancy firm wouldn't work. And it doesn't, not 100% AI. It does need humans, but it worked better than I thought it was going to. And the parts that didn't work taught me more than the parts that did. The question I started with was, will AI replace us in professional services? I now think that's the wrong question. The better one, the one I think every firm leader needs to be sitting with, is what do we need to become now that AI can do the rest? I think we need to become genuinely good managers, not just of people, although that's also really, really important, but of outcomes, of processes, of review systems, of clarity about what good looks like before the work starts, not after it goes wrong. Because when AI is doing the execution, the manager is the last line of accountability. And that's not a burden. That's actually where the value has always lived. We're just finally being forced to treat it that way at scale. I want to leave you with one question to consider for you to contemplate after listening to this episode. Because I think you probably have about 18 months before the vast majority of junior work, compliance work, etc., can largely be automated. The stuff that juniors do today. And so what are you doing with that time, those 18 months, to make sure that your team, your juniors, and all the way through your organization are developing the judgment that your clients will still want to pay for? That's the question. And it needs an answer now, not when the automation arrives. If you're a leader in an accountancy firm and you'd like to talk about this topic more, I'm interviewing firm leaders as part of my research for a different book I'm writing called the Accountancy Playbooks. So please do reach out and let's arrange a conversation. Matt's article that I mentioned a few times in this episode is linked in the show notes, and I'll link to episode 164 there too if you haven't heard about it and decided to listen to this episode anyway. And for the Accrual Intentions book, which is designed to be written as a comedy novel, I suppose, of taking you through the experiment and the journey that I went on, is designed to both be funny and entertaining, but also help you learn from the experiment and perhaps explore some of the ramifications that it has for the future and take you on that journey in a more natural way rather than just giving you a load of predictions and then you deciding which ones that you want to listen to. So if you're interested in that book, you can check it out at accrualintentions.com/book to hear when that becomes available. Now, in my next episode of De-Stress Your Business, I interviewed Ron Baker, the incredible author and thinker on the future of professional services firms. And I was interviewing him on the topic of why any businesses that are still charging for their time via timesheets need to rethink their model. And this is particularly relevant as AI fundamentally changes the way that we're going to be working and where we spend our time to deliver client value. So please do subscribe to the podcast or to this YouTube channel to make sure you don't miss it. Otherwise, until next time, have fun.